to talk a little about this. I always tell people that my foundation was set up to be in the how business. Most of the years I was in politics, all we discussed was, what are you going to do and how much money are you going to spend on it? Is the Eurozone going to help Greece or not? If so, how much will it cost? That's the sort of thing people talk about. But when you look at any problem, what becomes readily apparent is however much money you have or don't have, the most important thing is how do you propose to do what it is you're doing so you get the results you want. If you want to save the Eurozone and you don't think there should be a run on Spanish banks, which are running, and the Spanish government was running a budget surplus before this financial meltdown. Then you have to ask yourself, well, if you have a certain amount of money, should we increase the deposit insurance on depositors' accounts in these banks? Should the Central Bank of Europe be buying the sovereign debt of the country so as to keep its interest rates down? Should there be an issue of Euro bonds to provide infrastructure investments so that Greece doesn't have an unemployment rate that goes from its present terrible level over 20% all the way to 30%? And so that people have something to look forward to when they get up in the morning. How do you propose to do these things? So in this competition that you have launched with the Gates Foundation, you have to do, I think, two things. First of all, you have to find a way, in a creative, interesting way, to make sure people know what the facts are, and then to answer the how question. And so I want to set up the context for that before we go to the questions. I think it's obvious to all of you that we live in the most interdependent age in human history, that for good or ill, what happens in one place affects what happens elsewhere. You have no idea how much time we spend in America worrying about whether problems in the Eurozone will slow our economic recovery and affect our presidential elections. This can be very good in many ways. One of the great stories of the 21st century, which is not often appreciated, is the extent to which cooperative scientific research has led to breathtaking breakthroughs. In astrophysics now, we have identified 10 planets outside our own solar system that seem to be far enough away from their suns and dense enough that they might be able to support life, meaning that we might not be alone in the universe, which would quickly make a lot of these other problems seem small if it turned out to be true. I wish I could be 20 again. I'd take my chances on becoming president just to see what happens. In particle physics, for a brief period, the Great Hadron Super Collider experiment, which is in Cern, Switzerland, near the French border, firing subatomic particles into a magnet in the Italian Alps, seemed to say that for the first time in history, a tiny particle with mass had traveled faster than the speed of light. In other words, the neutrinos seemed to have arrived before they left. And I had a fascinating conversation with a physicist named Brian Greene, who writes a lot of books about this. And I said, do you think this happened? He said, no, this time I think they made a mistake, because it's like a GPS system and it's hard to measure things in billionths of a second. And it appears that that actually happened. But there are a lot of physicists who believe that there is a fourth dimension to reality, and that's what the string theory of physics is all about. And you might live to see the discovery of something other than time, space, and distance. which might explain the fact that so many of us see people we disagree with and think they live in a parallel universe. There might actually be one. One discovery in particle physics which has not been disputed and has enormously important implications was done at the Fermi Lab in the United States, in Illinois, where atoms were broken apart and subatomic particles called muons were measured. In traditional physics theory, any charge in a subatomic particle, an electronic charge, positive or negative, has to be offset precisely equally by an opposite charge, so that the positive and negative have to be equal. And that's the idea, is that that's the way atoms hold together. And if there were inequality, we would all just fly apart. The problem with that is it does not explain evolution. It doesn't explain how we might have changed from the one-celled organisms in the primordial slime hundreds of millions of years ago to where we are tonight in this beautiful auditorium. And in the Fermi Lab, they discovered that ever so slightly, muons, subatomic particles called muons, the positive ones slightly outweighed the negative ones. For an optimist like me, I thought, thank God. But the truth is that this is the first evidence we have had that might allow us finally to do what Mr. Einstein wanted to do and couldn't, to unify biology, chemistry, and physics and explain how the world works from the ground up. It's an interesting time to be alive. And a lot of you, particularly those of you who are younger, will someday find yourselves having to explain the implications of this to people in ways that get them to buy a certain product or another. But it's exciting, it's important. In a more mundane way, a couple of weeks ago, on one day, Germany became the first country ever to generate 22 gigawatts of electricity from the sun, the equivalent of 20 nuclear power plants from solar power. And in spite of all the naysayers, Deutsche Bank, not some ardent green group, Deutsche Bank says that the Germans have netted 300,000 new jobs out of their solar initiative, and that has dramatically helped them to increase industrial productivity, national security, and their manufacturing base. There are lots of other things I could talk about in this regard. I just want to mention one because it's part of what I do and part of what the partnership I have with Grupo APC and many other companies through the Global Initiative means. There are more private citizens seeking to do public good than ever before. The rise of non-governmental organizations and the rise of small donors and people who have limited amounts of time making common cause with millions of others is one of the great phenomenons of the early 20th century. The United States has 1 million such NGOs, and half of them have been formed in the last 15 years. And this is happening all over the world. The UK just started a crowdfunding site so that ordinary citizens could kick in a little money and invest in new startups, all based on information over the internet with certain transparency requirements. And a substantial number of companies, even in this lousy economy, are being started every month because of that. The world has, as all of us know, a lot of problems. I started with some of the interesting things because those of you who are empowered to make the most of your lives are fortunate to be alive at this time. But you can't overlook the fact that our interdependence has decidedly negative as well as positive implications. Interdependence simply means that all the world's borders look more like nets than walls. and that divorce is not an option. It can be positive, negative, or both. Today, by and large, it's both. The three big problems of interdependence are, first, it's not producing shared prosperity. There's way too much inequality. And it's increasing in many places as those well-positioned to claim the benefits of a world dominated by information technology, science, high-end manufacturing, those benefits go, and finance, those benefits go to people who are a relatively small number of people on the planet. And therefore, you have, both within and across national borders, dramatically increased inequality. About half the world's people still live on $2 a day or less. In Haiti, where I spend a lot of my time working, in the poorest country in our hemisphere, before the earthquake, 70% of the people were living on less than $2 a day. Within the United States now, before the financial meltdown, the economy had produced very few jobs, incomes were flat, costs of health care and higher education were exploding, that so bad that 90% of the gains went to the top 10% of us, 43% of the gains of the previous decade to the top 1% of us, and the median family income after inflation was $2,000 lower than it was the day I left office before the financial meltdown. This inequality problem is a global one that, if left unaddressed, will impose not only incredible constraints on the lives of billions of people, but also constraints on the ability of growth and prosperity to continue to maintain the standard of living in Europe, the United States, Japan, Canada, and the rising countries. India has the world's largest middle class, 350 million people, and the world's largest number of profoundly poor people, 450 million people, without, so far, the ability to connect the two so that prosperity becomes shared. This is a huge global problem. The second problem we have is that there is too much instability. We all like a little instability. You couldn't make a living in advertising if there were no instability, right? And the whole idea is get people to buy something new, increase market share, think of a new idea that makes people see something in a different way. Personally, my favorite ads in the United States are those ads encouraging people to switch from cable to direct TV, where you start out with a problem and something disastrous happens. If you don't get along with your daughter, she winds up going in an alternative lifestyle. She marries a guy with too many tattoos. She has a child that wears a dog collar, don't have a granddaughter with a dog collar, switch to DTV. They're the funniest ads I've ever seen. What does that mean? If this were a totally static society, if there were no instability in it, there would be no space for growth, for opportunity, for new ideas to emerge, for new ways of thinking and doing to emerge. You want a little bit, but if you have too much, then people get scared and the whole thing shuts down. So the financial crisis starts in America based on mortgages, leads to a financial collapse, goes to the UK and Ireland and Iceland, where they did not have some of the more esoteric financial devices we did, but where they had the same problem we had, which is too much money was loaned at too high a risk, at too low an interest rate, with too little cash to back it up. Then the housing bubble in Spain brings their house of cards down, and people say, oh, the Spanish, they weren't responsible. They had a budget surplus before this happened. This was a financial collapse. Then briefly, China had 35 million unemployed manufacturing workers. And we've all been crawling back from that since. There's a lot of other examples of instability. Cross-border terrorism, narco-trafficking, cyber terrorism, the politics of division, India versus Pakistan, the politics of repression and the reaction to it in Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Syria. All these things are exacerbated, and change is facilitated by the rapid movement of information around the world. But trying to figure out how to have a good outcome can sometimes be exceedingly challenging. The last problem the world has is that the growth pattern we're on is unsustainable because of climate change. No matter what the deniers say, the world is warming at an unsustainable rate. Soon, ships will cross the North Pole in the summertime. That's the good news. The bad news is that the acceleration of the melting of the ice pack on Greenland will occur. Greenland, which unless you're Danish, most people don't visit, has 8% of the world's entire freshwater supply. If it were to melt off Greenland and fall into the North Atlantic, it could block the Gulf Stream, which sends warm water north in the wintertime and allows northern Europe, northern Canada, the northeastern United States to function in a normal way 12 months a year. If the Gulf Stream is blocked, there's a chance that those countries could be as cold as they were 700 years ago in the Little Ice Age. And some of the most productive economies in the world, Scandinavian economy, part of Canada, a section of the United States, could be virtually frozen for 3 months a year. We know that already the consequences of climate change are being felt in other insidious ways in some of the countries least able to handle them. But I'll give you just one example in the United States. When I was president, I protected about 60 million acres of national forest from being overdeveloped or torn down so that we could make our contribution to absorbing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and preserve a precious natural resource. And some of those forests are disappearing now, not because they're being logged, but because of a little insect called the southern pine beetle, which we learned to handle in the American South a long time ago, and now it's all the way up in the northern forests because of global warming. So we have to change the way we produce and consume energy, which is why I think what they did in Germany a couple of weeks ago was so important. Why I think what's happening in the Rio +20 conference is so important. Very briefly, there's a big difference in the way you have to manage this change in very poor places and already wealthy ones. But there is a role for you in both. Very poor places do not have the systems that we take for granted, so that people just as smart as we are don't get a chance to live the lives that we lead. I mean, think of all the things you're taking for granted right now. It's hot outside. You would be surprised if the air conditioning failed and all this hot air I'm putting out made you uncomfortable. You'd be surprised if the lights went out, if the camera failed, if the microphone went out. If you don't like what I'm saying, you can get up and go to the restroom and have a glass of water. I spend a lot of my life in places where people can take none of that for granted. They need predictable, orderly systems that reward with positive consequences good conduct, hard work, talent, ability, learning. Wealthy countries have systems and they atrophy because people become more interested in holding on to present gains than creating future possibilities. More interested in holding on to their positions than advancing the purposes for which these systems were set up in the first place. This is human nature and as old as civilization itself. It is nothing to go into a tizzy about, nothing to write an epitaph for the Eurozone about, or for the United States for that matter. But you have to deal with it. Then the countries that are rising rapidly, Brazil, India, China, and others, they have both problems at the same time. They have people still poor they have to bring in to a system that's working, and they have to keep changing to adapt to the challenges they face. Here's what I know that should be the grounding, I argue, for everything that you do in this prize competition. The differences between people around the world make life more interesting. Our different perspectives make it possible for us to argue in a constructive way to find a better solution. But only if we understand that our common humanity matters more than our interesting differences. By far the most important discovery of the sequencing of the human genome, by far, is that all of us are genetically 99.5% the same. And unless your ancestors are 100% from sub-Saharan Africa, between 1 and 4% of your genome comes from our pre-human ancestors, the Neanderthals. Because beginning in the Middle East and Europe, when humanity moved out of Africa, we shared the planet with the Neanderthals for 40,000 years. Turns out we liked each other better than we knew. Now, people laugh when I say this, but it's true. My wife's a Secretary of State, and my daughter did not think it was any scientific breakthrough to learn that I was part Neanderthal. They knew that already. But they were shocked to learn that they were. And they were laughing. But you think about it. Every difference that you can see in this audience, every difference, skin color, body shape, height, eye color, even gender, every non-age related difference you can see is rooted in 1/2 of 1% of what you are biologically. And yet nearly everybody on Earth spends 99.5% of their time worrying about the 0.5% of themselves that is different from somebody else. All right? And look, that some of you can make a living off of that. Right? I wish and I'm not just talking about politics. I wish I were a little taller. I wish I were a little thinner. I wish I had a little plastic surgery. I mean, you know I'm right? Even the grievances we have against others who have oppressed us are rooted in 0.5% of who they and we are. And this is the most important thing. What works in the modern world? What works are creative networks of cooperation. Things are changing fast. Nobody has all the answers. The more you can get the crowd involved, the more likely you are to empower people to do something about it. It cannot all be done through social networks and in cyberspace, as the reformers in Egypt learned, and as Occupy Wall Street learned. Sooner or later, you got to show up and get involved in the political system, because in the real world, real decisions will still be made that affect a range of choices available to all of us. But it is true that what works are networks of cooperation. Everywhere in the world, people are forming such things. They're doing well. And we just have to decide whether we want a future of creative cooperation or one of constant conflict. one of shared prosperity and shared responsibilities, or one of winner take all. And the people who do what you do can have a major impact, first by telling people what the facts are. In the United States anyway, even though an 8-year-old can get on the internet and find out in 30 seconds something I had to go to university to learn, there is an enormous amount of disinformation or absence of emphasis on things of surpassing importance, and an obsession in politics with the trivial and the fleeting. I'll just give you one example. In the Republican presidential primaries, if you didn't say global warming was a hoax, you couldn't get nominated. You had to basically, it's the only political party in any major country in the world where you essentially had to not say, I believe that the world is warming at an unsustainable rate, and we have to do something about it. There was a congressman with an otherwise 100% conservative voting record defeated in his own primary because he said just that. He said, I want free market-oriented resolution of this, but climate change is a real problem. It's going to ruin our future. We better do something about it. He was out of there. So the interests that were benefiting from the current energy situation funded the most distinguished critic of climate change, a physics professor at the University of California at Berkeley, to do a study. And he had a theory, which was the only serious one I ever heard, actually. He said, I think they've been measuring the temperatures too close to urban areas, which are growing rapidly, and they're warmer than rural areas. We ought to correct for that and really see if the planet is warming as fast as we say, and if it's caused by human behavior. So yesterday's energy interests gave him a bunch of money, the traditional energy sources. And the ideological right gave him a bunch of money. And he came back before a committee of the Tea Party Congress and said, okay, I did it. I did 1.3 billion temperature measurements, billion. I corrected for all the biases in previous studies. And my finding is that the other guys are right. Global warming is real, it's a terrible problem, it's going to wreck our future if we don't do something about it. The silence in the room was deafening. This is a huge story, right? Their number one academic validator. It was not on the evening news, it was not on the front page of any newspaper, no one knew it happened. And instead, we worry about the minutiae of this or that campaign strategy. So this is the problem. A lot of the facts that will form the trend lines of the future are not apparent to people. And what citizens need, as much as anything else, is honest, synthesizing intelligence. The ability to put apparently disparate but profoundly related facts together in a simple way that explains what the issue is, and then an idea about how to do something about it. You can do that. And I think it is profoundly important. I think the power of example matters. And I will just give you a couple of examples on that. I work in Haiti, the poorest country in the Caribbean, but the Caribbean in general, which includes islands that used to belong to France and to the UK, and some of them are still allied, have the highest electric rates in the world because, except for Trinidad, they have to import all their fuel. Every one of them could be energy independent with the sun, the wind, geothermal, and biomass, basically converting their garbage to electricity. We should do that. The island nations of the world are the most vulnerable to climate change. I'll give you another example. Costa Rica is a small country with an income twice the Central American average that is already 92% clean energy, 26% national parks, 51% forest cover. They import only $1 billion a year in oil, all for their cars. If they became the first country in the world to drive around on electric cars, fueled by their excess capacity in clean energy, it would prove